Yeah, this is the company I work for. Small company, just two of us. We do primarily game design consulting and also development. Mostly what we do is location-based games. We do all sorts of all different types of games. So in terms of our own development, our own personal interest, our own personal background, a lot of it is tied to location-based games. We are two of the founders of the Mountain Play Festival, which actually the first year was in this room right here. The first time I ran, which is a festival, large festival of street games that runs every year in New York. We ran it in Amsterdam as well. That tries to sort of gather as many examples of street games and try to be sort of as broad and as large as possible to see what types of games we're programming out in this state for bringing together, create a forum for ideas as possible. So that Greg and myself run with having to cut off. So I'm about to with three others, Nick, Kira, and Catherine. So in terms of the kind of location-based games that we're talking about, just to use some examples of things that we've worked on as individuals and as people and warriors, players use payphones to repurpose existing infrastructure that was payphones to play a game about territory control. Game like Conquest, in which the city sort of transforms. People have to, it's not sure special, there's also large inflatable totems, which for some reason seemed to be a big thing in location-based games for a few years. That was like the initial thrust of location-based games was involved human inflatable totems for some reason. This happened to their totems, but as well as like semicodes, we had to take pictures of and using those semicodes to control parts of the city. Pact with Hatton, which was a game that was played in New York that was part of the game class, in which players would run the role of ghosts and Pac-Man the streets. And this game is very interesting for us in particular, because I learned a lot about large-scale games and the sort of fantasies that are attached to the kind of interest level that they generate and why. We've also done a lot of sort of context-based games. That's often a context in which we do sort of like large location-based games. There's one of the places people ask. So, for example, we did while we were at Game Lab, and we did Neil also looked at at the same time. They did a yearly game for the conference, and 1 year Greg and I worked on getting some pieces, which was a game, particularly control of certain sections of the conference. And we also made our own games like David Puck, which try to use golf and allow us to create virtual golf, new golf course wherever you are. So that's the sort of the background of the kinds of location-based games that we've been involved in. And for the purpose of this talk, I wanted to talk about just a little bit about what, so like very quickly, history of location-based games, very, very briefly, and sort of like the future and present state of them. So, back to the past. The location-based games have been played forever. I mean, you can sort of think of most games, if you don't involve board games in which players project the game into sort of imaginary or abstract spaces, everything else, at least traditionally, was played in the context of location. Originally, soccer, golf, all these kinds of games that we associate didn't have pre-established sort of official sanctioned spaces to do it in, and there were places that you sort of had to reinterpret your surroundings and use the surroundings that you had in order to play them. These kinds of games evolved into very large, very elaborate things. This is the game that I like to use an example. This is the Course of HA in Bloomfield in Italy. It's a yearly game where you have these huge sort of statues, these huge bases with statues of saints on the top, and there's a race through the city to get them into the church. It's kind of weird that one of the ones always gets to go in first, but then it's a race between the two other ones to get in before the doors are closed. It's like weird and kind of reminiscent of Inception in a lot of ways. But these huge crowd being chased into the church. But it's actually a game that it is very specific to the place. We'll talk about knowledge, the city sort of has evolved itself, has evolved this game, and to the point where there's no real winners except the ones that the way that you win is by having the city itself vote on the winners. There's a long-term discussion post-game as to who handled it. It doesn't really matter who gets in there first, but it's like, oh yeah, they made it in first, but they handled they knew how to take corners in a way, they knew shortcuts, etc. in ways that other people don't. So it's a great example of sort of what these games have evolved into over time. There's tons of them. There's not the only one. There's the Pavia and Schema, there's the famous Running Bowls, there are many types of these kinds of games. And also, even when sort of more established forms of, when sort of more official forms of vocation-based games or sort of sports appear, people still manage to repurpose their local surroundings. It wasn't like once that occurred, it wasn't the end of that. People still consistently, there was lots of games, and even ones that specifically referenced sort of more established ones, but that still took into account their location, were modified by it. And stickballs is a classic example of you, and there, the actual street, the cars, locations, I mean, those are all part of the game and used as part of the game. So that's sort of the historically, there's been a lot of these games, and there's a very sort of folk history of them. So as to the present, right now there's a lot of interest. I guess I went to this title a little too quickly, but there's a lot of interest, a sort of resurgent interest in location-based games. And a lot of it seems to be tied to the advent of ubiquitous media and technologies such as mobile phones, mobile computing, etc. And so a lot of what people want out of these technologies, they sort of project these fantasies of what big games could be or should be. And so there's this idea of the kinds of ways in which we'll project all this information onto the city and we'll project back to us, and these kinds of fantasies. And there's well, not tons of examples, but there are many examples of these kinds of games. For example, Parallel Kingdoms, which is an MMO, massive multiplayer online game, in which there's virtual enemies that are distributed at the space. So there's a dragon at the supermarket, you can go kill them. Or if you want to go kill them and get some loot, you can go there and you can kill them. And this represents one of the kind of classic notions of what people sort of imagine when they think of location-based games. Like, oh, there's like these virtual things that are sort of projected onto my space, the space surrounding me, and it would be fun to do that. Another example is Tron Life Cycle, which this is kind of like one of the examples of like location. Like, this is what the game that everybody wants to make. Like everyone, they think of the sort of location-based mobile game, but this is the one that everybody thinks of in some variety. The idea here is that you, using your GPS, you trace out areas and try to prevent the sort of like typical Tron light cycle game, which I assume everybody is familiar with. So these are there are games out there. Currently, there are a lot of games like this, but they run into some issues that a lot of these are built on fantasies of what we would like location-based games to be or how we would like them to function. But unfortunately, they don't take into account the reality of location-based games, which is actually like the Tron light cycle game is impossible to play. The idea that you have to run 2 blocks to start to make a move, not even to finish a move, but to start to make a move, you have to run that kind of distance. Nobody's going to play that thing. You're going to get a couple of hardcore players that will be willing to engage to have that level of sort of intense participation, but most people will just be entirely aced by it and won't even play it at all in any kind of fashion. So the reality is more like this, that this is the way that people actually want to play location-based games. They think they want to run around, they think they want to be these sort of like superheroes, super spies, all plugged in and do these things, but they don't actually, they really don't want to do that. And it's true that by the time you give them the option to, they flatly refuse. One of the games that we made was the Kickoff, which had the option of going through, of playing with GPS, the sort of like legit mode, and then there was the exploring and snoring mode. And the snoring mode, which you can just play on your couch, like overwhelmingly, we had a couple of players that loved it and keep on writing to us, and they were like, oh, we just loved the going, out in the city and exploring it and discovering new places in my neighborhood that I would never have gone. There's like 4 of those dudes. And then there's like a bunch, the vast majority, who never ever leave their house, or don't seem to play it outside of the context of their house. So, yeah, the reality is that most people don't have very, very, very fixed patterns of usage in their space. That there's this kind of, there's this fantasy about how we engage in the kind of appetite that we have for engaging with our physical world, but the reality that is much less. We generally go to very few places. We generally do very little modification of our daily patterns. If a game asks us to go 3 blocks out of your way before going to work, you'll say no. You have other things to do. You won't accept that kind of imposition on the part of the game. So there are good examples out there of people who are doing things with location-based games that are operating just at that fantasy level. There's things like Foursquare, which is a very good example. Even though it's not technically a game, it's conceivably partially it's a game. I mean, there's clearly a sense of like this has to at least reference game elements in the overall, it's not necessarily or strictly speaking a game. But they do. One of the things that the Foursquare does very well is it does allow players to sort of engage at levels where it doesn't demand so much of them, and they sort of engage in their external world without really having to go beyond what they're willing to do. So this has been obviously very, very effective. Another one is Booyah, which is a sort of more Booyah Home, or sort of Booyah My Town. Which is a more explicitly gamey version of the kind of like check-in model, in which you take over locations. For those locations that you get money and points based on people checking in those locations. It was sort of like a little bit of like Foursquare meets Monopoly in a very, very, very thin way, but it's still it's still a very thin game. I'm not necessarily saying that negatively, a little bit, but you know, there isn't. The level of gameplay sort of level doesn't go much beyond that sort of like check-in. But this has been very, very successful. We managed to raise a bunch of money. I think it had, or may still have more users than Foursquare, although it's less of a kind of journalist star than Foursquare is. But so that's roughly what the kinds of games, the location-based games are now. But so what can we expect, what can we hope for in the future of location-based games? Mainly, at least our guess at Jan is that the check-in, while very effective at reducing things to literally the most sort of atomic form of presence possible. It is the check-in is just I was here for a sort of in possibly small time slice. It is the smallest amount of presence that you can project onto something. And while that's good, it's very effective. It's a very useful sort of starting point. It's not enough to really build that much on there. It's a little bit thin. And so what I think will happen in the future, and hopefully what will start happening, is that they'll start layering on extra, making those check-ins matter more by making them by having much more involved in terms of the way that you interact and some richer interaction. So, for example, the way that you check in, you play a game in order to have the check-in, so that there's some meaningful interaction for the actual check-in. That the process of engaging or with the game produces this, rather than just being something you can sit there and spam while sitting on your couch, just a button you can press wildly. And even that's successful. Just the button is successful. So, you know, I'm not getting on it too much, but you know, people are going to have to add on that extra layer. Another thing that you can add on to this idea of check-in is having artifacts. Gameplay is fantastic at leaving artifacts. What moves that people have done? What is the detritus that people have left over based on their play? And this is something that people want out of location-based games. They want to project themselves onto their surroundings, and games can do that very well beyond just a sort of counter of the location that you've been. There are many ways in which games can be very good at doing that. One example, and this is not just for pure log rolling purposes, it's just that I don't know what other guys are working on. They don't tell us like the competitions and all stuff. But this is an example, a very sort of simple example of the kinds of things that we're talking about. Alphabet City game that we're working on right now, where it uses locations around you, and you play using the names of location around you. You play a sort of simple word game with power-ups, and there's a little bit of complexity, but not much in terms of the game. And then effectively every location is a high scoreboard that people can compete for, and you find out when people have beaten you, what generally people are doing there, like how engaged you are with a particular location. Our sort of thinking behind this was that this adds a little bit more of that kind of interactive version to the act of checking in. It gives people a sense of, it allows people to engage at a level at exactly the level they want. They don't really care that much. They can view this as just a kind of pure word game. If they really want to aggressively go out throughout the city and take over every Burger King that they can find because that's their thing, they can. So it allows people a wide range of possible interactions, which is something that we think is important in terms of location-based gaming, because if you set the bar at the level of you have to run 4 blocks in order to make a move, you're done. Like, nobody will ever play this thing. You'll actually get a reasonable amount of press. It's not a bad idea if you just want to get your name in the paper. Like, reporters will call you up, but just nobody will actually play. So we think that something along these lines of just adding extra interactions and leaving behind artifacts based on those interactions, game artifacts, virtual ones, allow this was what the next step, necessary step in location-based game tooling. So yeah, hopefully we move far over. Thanks. And, any questions?
I'm particularly interested in this slide about beyond checking. So the reason why Forcework has so many users experience extremely simple. You press one button, checking.
Right.
That's what you want. So now you want an extra layer, game layer on it. How do you wish people to be more popular? Like you want to play game engine.
Well, I don't think it'll be more popular than Foursquare. I mean, I think to a certain extent, whenever you add an extra interaction, you limit the level of engagement, the number of people, like your market will inevitably shrink. I think there's a sweet spot, and this also depends on your aims. I mean, you can make a very, very hardcore game. You know, there's nothing wrong with, for example, parallel kingdoms. So it tells you have to go run and go 5 blocks out of your way to go kill a dragon. Like, some people will dig that, but you just have to accept, like, my audience will be tiny. I think there's a sweet spot in that level of engagement. And also that I think a lot of people probably do want more than just something between this, I will just press a button, and I will go 5 blocks out of my way to the supermarket. I mean, one of the things that right now, like, once again, with the fantasy of Foursquare, most people think that what they're doing is this kind of thing where, like, I will ping and all my friends will find out about it nearby. Really what they're doing is they're like, I'm at the bagel store, ding, 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 you know, like, I'm on my way to work. So adding a little bit more of that says, oh, actually, there is a way that you can interact with this a little bit more when you're at the bagel store. We can make this interaction a little bit more meaningful. I think that will help. But yes, it will lower your...
And also remember that Foursquare isn't successful because it's such a simple interaction. It's also you're collecting badges, and the collection mechanic is really powerful. So
right.
It's a check-in mechanic plus a collection mechanic that's layered on top of that. I think that's what makes it work.
Because that connection mechanic doesn't work, you know?
Okay.
I just did not heard. Yeah. So I get a few references to life cycle, Tron life cycle. And part of the problem is that GPS has a certain resolution. So you really can't have any accurate movement unless you go 5 blocks. So what I'm wondering is it perhaps the technology that, the importance of that technology, right? That people maybe they do want to run, they really want to run on their own block, their own process stream. But we just can't actually map that technology yet.
I mean, yes and no. There is probably a point of technology advance where I can map your movements down to the sub-foot level, you know, sub-meter level, like at the centimeter level. At that point, I can start doing much more interesting things. I don't know if that'll ever happen or not, but like there are certain things that are interesting. The problem with a lot of these things, it's not just the low resolution, it's the kind of interaction that they're asking you to do. It's not because the technology can't find it, it's because blocks are very long. That's the problem. That's what's problematic, you know. So there's not really a technological solution to that. Space is difficult to traverse. Space is expensive, and also largely featureless. Most space isn't that interesting. So if you go long distances, you know, it's just not that. Most of the time, usually you want to go 3 blocks out of your way because it doesn't look that much different than the road that you're on. You know, so I mean, those are problems that are not really amenable to sort of technological solutions or aren't easily solved by technological problems. You know, leaving technology won't necessarily resolve those.
Do you think that the actual mechanic of the checking game is as a Foursquare down so that technology comes out?
To make it passive?
Yeah, it's like passive. Do you think that is that actually?
I mean, I think in general, and probably most, this may be a bias as a game designer, that like discrete interaction that you willingly engage in are generally more actually pressing the button is compelling. Like having that moment of action and sort of reward and expectation, did I get the badge? Like that's very powerful psychologically. And I don't think you get that if you just turn on your phone like, oh hey, while you're walking down the street, you got 15 badges. If you got that passive, I don't think it would be as fun.
I guess I'm kind of saddened looking at location-based games and that there's no, and there doesn't seem to be any follow-up of the Beast in 2001 into games that were actually about transforming the space you were into that fantasy, not going and finding a dragon, but going somewhere very specific because there was a story. And it seems like it's all headed towards like get blue. Like now you can check into movies. You know, do you? I mean, are you guys working on anything? I know Nick, so I know his kind of point of view. But do you see that coming into the development cycle anywhere with this stuff as the technology gets better, or do we think that narrative stays in your TV? And
I think there's ways to get narrative. I think the problem with things like the Beast is that the way that the narrative is structured, like the projecting that narrative onto a physical space like that, forces you to move around in a way that people don't want to do. And then this is that classic problem of sort of large-scale game design that you think of it's sort of ant farming, where you view it from a 10,000-foot view, and you say like, oh, here's this map, I'm going to put all these things here, and you don't realize that, oh, that's actually drudgery to go through all of these. There are ways that you can address that by having the narrative delivered to you relative to where you are. So it's just go 200 feet over there. It's not necessarily a particularly pre-established location, but go 200 feet over there and then some more narrative.
Go to the nearest drugstore.
Right, go to the nearest drugstore. Like these kinds of things are like using relative geographies rather than absolute ones. Like it helps do some of that. Making things, just in general more procedural rather than having very sort of established, very strict linear narratives. You make them more procedural, and that gives you much more of that sort of playfulness, and it makes the system more adaptable to your surroundings. So I think, there are ways to do that, and I think people are starting to work on a little bit. The problem is that there aren't that many people working location-based games yet, and I think that's going to change. But not badly. I mean, it's not going to be the next console revolution or something like that, but there are going to be more people working. But I guess to answer your question, yes, I think there's hope. It hasn't quite arrived yet, but like there are glimmers of it. Explicitly designed for sort of commercial and other reasons. We don't explicitly design for kids, but generally, I think that the tendency to not want to. You can make people move around a lot in event-based games, games that are very clear beginnings and endings. What generally people don't want to do is just take out their phone and now run 5 blocks. Like that doesn't really work. If you put them in if you have a very clearly bounded context in which you say, like, this is the start of the game, this is the end of the game, you're going to do this, you're going to have this different competition against these guys, there's going to be a leaderboard over there, you're going to see at the end, like, then you can get, 45-year-olds to run. But so I don't think, you can probably resolve the issue a little bit with younger people, but it's not going to get you all the way there, unless you go for event-based situations. Thanks. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Naomi Clark, and I'm like Mattia, I'm a game designer. Mattia was talking about location-based games, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Facebook games, which, unlike location-based games, there are a ton of people flocking to, and making it kind of either a gold rush or strip mining situation in terms of the market and the players, depending on who you ask. I've been spending the last few years designing Facebook games. And within the game design community, there's a lot of either skepticism or just sheer disheartenment about this particular genre of games and the platform they're on, because they have a little bit of a low-rent strip mall feel to them. A lot of the mechanics on Facebook are designed to sort of be exploitative of players' time or patience or money. But I actually think that there's a ton of potential with this model of game, which actually existed before Facebook got very big. And which most of the games that are doing well on Facebook, at least for the last couple of years, are all sim games in one way or another. They simulate the player running a business or a city or or perhaps most famously a farm. This is a game that I've been working on for the past 5 or 6 months, which I think is a good example both of the status quo on Facebook, and also I'm hoping points in some directions of what may make social games and style games that are on Facebook interesting both for learning and for the use of simulations across different types of purposes. So in Trash Tycoon, as in many other games on Facebook, you have a city. And in fact, the most popular game on Facebook right now for the last year or so is a game called Cityville, which has been played by, I think, over 120 million players now. And in that game, as in SimCity and many other famous city simulation games, you kind of build the world from scratch. You're creating an environment in your own image. But what we decided to do for this game is take a slightly different tack. You go into a city that already exists, but that has some severe problems. The game's called Trash Tycoon because your job is basically to be the Uber garbage collector of the city and clean up a bunch of properties, businesses, all sorts of things around town that have become hopelessly clogged with waste. Now, what you can do with the garbage that you clean up is you can actually feed it into these buildings, like this one that you see here in the center of the screen, and you can choose what types of sort of industrial upcycling processes to use to turn the garbage that you collected into new consumer products that you can sell. And this whole process is actually a simulation of something that happens in the real world with an organization called TerraCycle, which is in New Jersey. TerraCycle collects various types of consumer waste packaging and then turns them into new types of products. This is just one example that they take Frito-Lay chip bags and turn them into things like tote bags and binders. And the list goes on and on. There are dozens of different types of products, from clothing and school supplies all the way to furniture and stuff like that that can actually be upcycled out of post-consumer waste. And this is thought by a lot of ecologists to be a preferable alternative to the more traditional downcycling, where you can turn like old brown paper bags into recycled paper. This is actually, but it has to be broken down into its constituent elements first. This is actually sort of taking waste and turning it into something that's slightly more valuable, in theory at least, than the original thing that you started with. So TerraCycle, how they work is they have these collection points that are all over the country. This one is in the parking lot of a Walmart, and that people who are participating in the program can turn in all sorts of different packaging and waste that can't normally be recycled. And so this is a little cut off, but they have 21 million people who are registered as members, and 100,000 teams around the world. They collect about 2 billion chip bags out of their units of waste. And what people get for participating in this is they earn points on the TerraCycle website. So they're already engaging in a type of point-based gamification for this project. And the points can then be turned into donations that go to a nonprofit organization of the team's choice. So there are a lot of community groups, churches, schools, and things like that around the country that are participating and then earning money to fund other types of projects. So what we're doing is taking this basic model of, well, you collect trash, and then you can turn it into something else, make it into the basis of the game. So in this game, whenever you clean up one of these piles of garbage, this area that you're looking at in the game is the garbage dump. But there are a lot of other areas of parts, residential neighborhoods and industrial neighborhoods and so forth. But every time you decide to clean up some trash, these little icons that you see right near the bottom of the screen up here, you click to pick them up, and you earn some points, and you engage in a little bit of moment-to-moment gameplay. And the reason I'm talking about that is that this is what I think of as really the base of what you have to build in order to make a game that's both engaging and that can have influence on people or teach people something, is a very immediate moment-to-moment interaction that lets people understand how they're making decisions or taking actions within a game space that have a tangible outcome. And mechanisms of immediate reward are really useful here. So in Trash Tycoon, you click on something that looks dirty to clean it up, and then you immediately see it get a little tiny bit cleaner, and then a bunch of things pop out which you can collect. And some are rewarding, like experience points and money, and other are these raw materials of trash which you can then upcycle. Now this level of game design about the moment-to-moment engaging interaction is something that was a very heavy emphasis of casual downloadable games, especially in the first, or the mid-2000s, I think was really the height of that type of gameplay. So games like Bejeweled, or Diner Dash, which is my game lab where Christine and I used to work, and Hegel is maybe the most classic example, or they kind of excel at really making this aspect of gameplay extremely strong, so that you can just kind of sit and engage in little interactions that provide you with immediate feedback. But there's other levels beyond that sim games can really help access. So for instance, in Trash Tycoon, we have the core game loop, which is the concept that we often use in game design to talk about what effect the player's actions have on the system of the game, and how are those effects represented, and what are the next decisions that the player makes, and so forth. The player cleans things, then upcycles them into products that they then sell, and using this sort of eco-capitalist model of you can actually turn trash into goods that people want, the same as TerraCycle. And then by expanding and building their empire further, they can unlock new areas in the city over the course of a simple narrative where the mayor of the city recognizes your contributions, and then you actually gain access to more things that you want to clean. Now, and if this loop is strong enough in terms of the basics of engagement, you can sort of keep coming back and keep playing the game over and over again. And most successful games that involve resource management or simulation have loops like this. So you can think, okay, I understand, like I want to clean something and upcycle it and sell it, but then why do I want to go back to cleaning? And interestingly, it's actually that top arrow that I unlock a new place to start the whole thing over and clean again. That's the one where we actually see the strongest player demand. Like they want more. They go back to the beginning of the cycle and they get more raw materials to clean and to then turn into trash. Even though narratively that's maybe the least simulationist of what you would go running around looking for in the real world. The next step up that I want to talk about is systemic complexity. And this is often thought of as the real educational value of simulation games, but sometimes games in general as a venue for systems thinking and for students learning about systems. It's very easy to see in a lot of sim games. If you are playing SimCity, you can sort of set what the property taxes are like, who can move into your city, and you have all these sort of like complex interactions between different types of resources that ebb and flow. But in the model that I use for design, this is really building on top of a very simple, basic engagement cycle. Because if you don't have that moment-to-moment engagement, then you have a much more cerebral game, which is actually where the complexity can actually be too much of what the player has to engage with in order to get into the game. And if you build a game where you have a simple game loop that comes first, that players can really understand, see how their decisions influence something, and then you build on top of that a more complex systems that players can learn over time. You have a much more solid foundation to scale up towards understanding of complex systems than if you just dump a rule book with an intricate strategy onto a student's lab or a player's lab. So in Trash Tycoon, what we have is actually another layer that's outside of that core game loop. Actually, that text up there probably should say something other than core game loop, since this is an outer game loop. So as you clean up your city, which is what was represented in the first loop, your city has a score called greenness. That rises as you sort of make the city a friendlier place to commute via bicycle, you actually start to see an impact on how green your city is. This in turn causes more residents to move to your city, your population goes up. But as your population grows up in various areas of the city, they generate more trash, which then you need to clean up more of. So you can kind of see how this outer loop then feeds back into the inner loop, but we don't actually expect players to understand how to balance or keep tabs on the greenness and population of the city until they first sort of become engaged by that core game loop that I was showing before. And in the long term, we are actually going to be adding and bolting onto the system more loops and more sort of economic interactions, trade-offs, players, things where players have to make tricky decisions about emphasizing one area or another, including things like cutoff down here is a green power system that you can build support for in your city and hook various neighborhoods in your city up to a sustainable energy grid, and vertical farming, the idea of being able to do agriculture in densely populated urban areas by using unused space on the outside of buildings. So all of these kinds of things, when you hook them in, you start getting increasingly complex dynamics that let you see how different types of ecological and economic systems overlap and intersect. But if you dump this all onto a player's lab immediately, they might actually be very turned off. So the top level, and really what I would describe as the change orientation of Trash Tycoon, is the idea that by engaging with all of these types of systems, even the very basic idea of, oh, okay, I'm picking up a piece of trash, but then I can do something with it, creates a different type of awareness in players' minds. But this might seem like a simple thing, the idea that you're just exposing people to the idea of like, oh, well, I could sign up to upcycle this product in the real world, and then it's just a sort of an advertisement for a TerraCycle. But when you have a more complex interaction with the system, when you actually see and choose your own motivations based on what a game system gives you to work with, you create patterns in your mind, and this is something that there have been a lot of interesting research studies about recently, that for instance, when people play Tetris, and if any of you have played Tetris for a long period of time, you might be aware of this feeling of like, even when you close your eyes, you still see the bricks falling. This is actually something that's now being neurologically measured and has been found to change things like post-traumatic stress syndrome and how people's brains respond to memory. So games have a huge potential to allow people to look at their own behavior and think a little bit differently about what they're doing in the real world because of motivations and goals that they set up for themselves when they decided to become involved in a game. And then on platforms like Facebook, you also have the opportunity to let other people know that you're playing this particular type of game and share it with them, which then leads to other conversations. So in Trash Tycoon, for example, we have a team system where you can play with your friends, neighbors, and that actually the TerraCycle teams, if you join one of those, that's also present here in the game, so that we have a loop that goes between the real world upcycling and recycling activities are reflected in what goes on in the virtual world, and then that virtual world sort of bounces back through both social connections and the earning of points that you can redeem in the real world. And so this last slide, I just wanted to say that I think one of the most powerful thing about games is that they can lead us to engage in more self-reflection about what's driving us and what kinds of motives and goals we take up. And I'll just cut it off there since I think we're running over. I'm adding it back.
Oh, okay.
And also, there's cookies in the back. If you want a sugar cookie.
I work for Institute of Play. Institute of Play is a nonprofit in New York City for games, education, and civic engagement. We involve ourselves mostly with a school called Plus to Learn. This school was a collaboration between Institute of Play and New York City Department of Education with New Vision's. It's called School for Digital Kids. And my work with Institute of Play revolves mostly around working within this school. And this school is basically uses systems thinking and game design principles as the core basis of its educational model. And one of the things we do a lot is both play and create games. My job tends to be collaborating with the teachers and other educators at the school to develop experiences and classroom games and other game-like activities for the students. These activities can range anything from card and board games to digital games on mobile or non-mobile devices, and even experiences that combine both physical and digital components. Outside of my work with Institute of Play, I'm involved with an invented sport called Ball, created by fellow game designer Charles Amos. Since I joined with Ball, I've helped promote the game, helped play test it, helped refine the rule set, and do some visual design, including the logo up there. The game, its tagline is Dodgeball meets martial arts in 15 feet of rope. Basically, it's a game played on a circular court. A single tether ball is attached by a rope to the spot in the center of the circle on the ground. And teams of players, usually they work in teams of 3, to swing the ball on the rope and try to hit each other, kind of like a ball and chain, but soft-ish. You're allowed to block with your forearms and your shins, so that's the martial arts component. And this game was actually part of Come Out and Play. That's how I discovered it in 2009. So there's a bit of a linkage there with team's work. I'm also working in early stages on a game called Brothers in Farms. It's a strategy game that is going to help teach sustainable agriculture techniques, including things like companion planting and intercropping and permaculture. It's a very early stage of it. And the next thing I want to talk to you about is I've been experimenting with using Minecraft as an educational tool. Now, Minecraft is a really exciting game that came out, I think in April of last year. And the designer, Marcus Pearson, he decided to release the alpha of the game before it was even done. And even allow players to spend a little bit of money to then be able to continue to own the game as it's upgraded. And it exploded in popularity. It's, as you can see, it's a very unusual looking game. It's actually a procedurally generated world in which every single aspect of the world is made up of cubes, or otherwise known as voxels. And the ability that you have in this game is to explore this world and pick up these cubes, collect them into your inventory, and then change them or alter them, and then put them back into the world in any form that you want to. So what this really is the epitome of an open sandbox kind of world, and it has really wonderful implications in all types of fields, including education. So past few months I have been working with Minecraft and setting up a multiplayer server with one of my coworkers and allowing students from the Cluster School to join the server and play on it. And just to kind of see what happens, see what the kids can do, see what kind of experiences we can create for them, and how we can kind of interact. This is some of the stuff that is possible with Minecraft, and I hope that it gives some more ideas of kind of the educational applications that it has. The top left here is a recreation of Frank Lloyd Wright's Fallen Water. Over to the right is a full-fledged city with skyscrapers poking through the clouds. We have some pixel art. This thing says Yacht Olympics is actually a series of games that were designed within the system of Minecraft itself, including like kayak racing and climbing and underwater races and things like that. And despite the kind of blocky nature of the game, people have managed to create really amazing looking organic and round shapes such as this ship and this kind of futuristic circular spherical city. As I said before, that the game has multiplayer capabilities, and that's one of the really exciting aspects of it. And I want to talk not only about the world, but this multiplayer aspect and the characters in it. Minecraft has these really deceptively simple yet really expressive characters. It's a very simple set of rules that somehow combine to really give you like an insight into what the other player is doing and thinking. The characters can be reskinned. Very simple. You can import a skin into Photoshop or whatever, Microsoft Paint. Play with the pixels and upload it back to the site, and your character will have that skin. So it's very easy to customize it to give yourself any experience you want. And then the gestures in this game, punching, waving, leaning, and jumping, item interactions, if you're holding an item in your hand, it's visible to other players if you drop them. And my favorite part of it is the head actually follows the player gaze, meaning it's first-person view, so if you're playing the game, you're within your character's head. And when you're looking around, other people can see that your head is rotated in that direction looking at the thing. Now, this has probably been done in games before, but in most of those games, people are also pointing the gun in that direction. So I think that never really struck me as a powerful thing until I realized that if you're not doing anything, it's just like where you're looking. It's really a nice insight to the other player. People have been able to do nodding and other types of gestures too. Minecraft, I said, has had this explosion in popularity that has spawned very numerous other types of sandbox worlds, both in 2D and non-voxel based environments, and even ones that are almost clones of it. I'm showing you this because that's where I think a new kind of wave, I already see it happening, but a new wave of gaming is this sort of open sandbox world, and it's really exciting for educators because there are going to be many, many opportunities to explore different types of worlds with different types of systems and apply them to your own educational learning goals. So that's one of the main points I wanted to tell you guys, is that I think these open ended sandbox worlds are powerful resources, both for teacher and student authorship. And teachers can use them to create experiences for their students, and students can use them as creative tools to express their own knowledge and own ideas. Okay, I'm going to switch gears briefly and talk about a game called LA Noir that came out a few months ago. And the really exciting thing about this game is that it used a very advanced form of motion tracking to model an actor's face and their facial expressions and even the entire 3D geometry of this actor, and then put that into the game world. So all of the characters in this game world, their performances, their facial expressions that happen in the game were real-life actors doing these things. If you see it in action, I really recommend looking at the video. It's really striking just how realistic and how emotionally engaging these characters can be. Here's the problem though. The LA Noir setup looks something like this for an actor. It's highly, highly expensive. It's kind of not really connected to the experience that they're doing for. And so for an educational kind of application, it might be a little far off. However, there are things on the horizon that are looking pretty usable by us, because they use technologies that we already have, such as our MacBook cameras, an Xbox Connect, or even a regular webcam. This is a screenshot of an Open Frameworks program, which takes, webcam input and does a really, really advanced facial tracking, and actually can peel that face off from a photo and put it back on somebody else's face. It's a little creepy looking, but it's really exciting. The video I saw was taking many different celebrities' faces and projecting them onto the actor's face as he was turning his head around and making facial expressions. So here's one involving Michael Jackson. So this is one of the things, though, is that there's this thing called the uncanny valley, and that is basically as a character or something like a character becomes more realistic, your emotional response starts from 0 to getting higher and higher. Now, at some point before fully human, like unrecognizable from human, there is this dramatic dip in emotional response where people get severely creeped out by these things that look human but aren't quite, and there's like this thing that you can't quite grasp, and it's creepy. And it might be an evolutionary response to people that might appear ill or other things that make you want to avoid that person. So games now have approached this sort of realism where a lot of times when you see a character and they look really, really realistic, but but there's just like that little bit of kind of creepiness. It can be a real impediment to engagement and to the sorts of goals we might want to have. Now, I believe that with this sort of facial tracking software, if you're taking an input of a real human face and outputting it to what's supposed to look like a real human face, that is probably going to give you some sort of uncanny valley attributes. I think even Nellie Moore still has that a little bit of something that doesn't quite look right. However, I think that possibly, if this technology is accessible to everybody, you can take an input that's realistic and might produce an uncanny output if you try to, and instead use that information onto an abstracted character, such as one of these expressive Minecraft characters, and be able to track your facial expressions and do like a more cartoony sort of thing on the character's face. And I believe that this sort of thing could be a really powerful teaching tool, where if a teacher was in a virtual world with students and had built an experience, this teacher could potentially play a character and use their own acting and facial expressions to play that character more convincingly. And that's actually the main point I wanted to make, so thank you very much.
My name is Ira Fay, for those of you who don't know me. I'm going to try and break away from the instructional paradigm for a moment and ask all of you to get out a piece of paper and pencil, or a little tiny piece of paper, and write down, Post-it's fine, a game experience that was very meaningful to you, either creating a game or playing a game. So I'm actually going to stop when this goes off, so I want to go out and continue on. So I just want to give you a little bit of background on myself. An undergraduate degree in computer science. I got a master's degree in entertainment technology with this guy over here, same year. I worked at Disney, Max's, Activision, EA, starting as a programmer and then as a producer, and most recently as a producer and designer. And a month ago, I moved to New Haven to become a professor of game design. So I've been a teacher for 4 weeks. For the teachers in the audience, I cannot believe how you do it. I am exhausted. It's unbelievable. So my work is primarily in being a teacher now. It used to be making games as my main activity, but my primary work now is being a teacher. I'm teaching 42 undergraduates Introduction to Game Design. In my spare time, I'm also advising a bunch of different teams on a bunch of different things. And I look forward to advising all of you on the projects that you work on. I'm working with MindSnacks, they're a language learning game company for iPhone. I'm working with the Federal Reserve, some Facebook game teams on philanthropic games. And then in my spare time, I'm also trying to design some games. I figure if I want to teach about games, I should keep my skills fresh. And I'm most interested in educational games, games for positive social change. So seeing what you all are working on is so inspirational. I'm really excited about it, and I love questing them. So when you're thinking about this, trying to think about what can I say to you that's going to be useful to you in this as you're embarking on this process. So I think as we're thinking about games, there are sort of 3 ways that I think you can approach it. One is playing games, actually having your students play games in the classroom. Second thing I think you can do is have students make games. And Scott, you've been a big proponent of that. I completely agree with it. And the third thing is this gamification, actually using game mechanics as part of your teaching methodology. So, Nate, I know you used Alice. I went to CMU. Back in my day, there was no GUI for Alice. We programmed it in Python. And GameStar Mechanic, I think, is a great tool. And remember pen and paper. I mean, pen and paper is a great way, low cost, for students to make games. I mean, you can have them draw some squigglies and some lines and roll some dice, and you have a game, Candyland. So don't underestimate the power of playing games. And then playing games, I know there are several algebra teachers. I know David and Sarah and others are teaching algebra. MegaHigh.com, you probably already know about it, but in case you don't, they have some really good math games on there. Algebra Meltdown is a game they have, so there are a bunch of good options there. And then I just want to mention quickly, obviously I think people know this, but games provide a really good opportunity for assessment and feedback for students. So employing game mechanics is something that I try to do in my classroom, and I don't want to get into it too much, but gamification, and in the general term of that is just motivational design. What can we do in our classrooms to motivate students? And game mechanics are a way that we can motivate our students to learn. It achievements, collections, unlocks, teamwork and competition. Sarah, I know you mentioned the stickers putting around the room. I thought that was awesome. And that just great examples. I'm going to use them in my classroom. So when I was getting into the semester asking around other professors, what do you do for attendance? I think someone mentioned this earlier. You know, a lot of professors and I think teachers have an attendance policy where you have 100% and then you lose points. And so for my class, I have an attendance policy where you start at 0, you gain points, and there are streak bonuses, and there are perfect game bonuses, and I think that's just a really light example of using game mechanics. I have 25 seconds. So I was asked to do some awesome hunting. There was an article in the New York Times a week ago in which telepathy actually exists. So I'm really excited for telepathy to be used as part of our games in the future. Please feel free to email me. Thanks so much.